Welcome to TransferMarkt TV. I'm Ben Littlemore, and today I'm joined by Euan Robertson and Stefan Biankowski, and we are talking about Borussia Dortmund. The German side have one foot in the Champions League final after their 1-0 win against PSG last night, thanks to Nicholas Füllkrug's goal and a brilliant individual performance from Jadon Sancho. I wrote an article that's gone out on the TransferMarkt website. You can head over and have a look, just about how Borussia Dortmund are potentially one of the best-run clubs in Europe. If we look back to the last time they were in a Champions League final, which was also at Wembley against Bayern Munich in 2013, since then, the club, when we're looking at net spends, actually have recorded a profit of just over 130 million euros. In that same time frame, PSG have recorded a loss of over 1.2 billion. It really puts into perspective how much it's cost either side to get back to this stage. Stefan, I know you watch a lot of Bundesliga and follow it closely. Just how impressed were you with Dortmund, and was it reflective of how they've been in the Bundesliga this season?
That's two very different answers. I was very impressed that it absolutely is not reflective of how they played in the Bundesliga this season. They really have been a Jekyll and Hyde side this season. And that really comes down to Edin Terzic and the kind of tactics that he seems most comfortable with. In the Bundesliga, they've been a really inconsistent side. They've been a team who's struggled to exert their dominance on games. We've obviously seen Bayer Leverkusen dominate that league with a really impressive kind of possession-based style of football from Xabi Alonso, which kind of almost goes back to that kind of tiki-taki football we saw from Spain and Spanish clubs maybe 10 or 15 years ago. That's more or less the kind of football that Bayern Munich have played over the years, obviously with some kind of changes, but more or less, if you want to kind of win a league title in German football, you have to be able to dominate every single game, possession-wise, passing-wise, chances-wise. And that's obviously pretty bog standard stuff. Most football fans know that. Manchester City do that. Real Madrid do that. The teams in Italy who tend to win it tend to dominate their leagues as well, possession-based. So you have to have that kind of style of football to win a league championship. On the other hand, Terzic's kind of preference for defensive, counter-attacking football may not have set them up well for the Bundesliga, but it set them up extremely well for the Champions League. On Wednesday night, we saw what I thought was a very kind of really kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Just composed defensive system where everyone knew what they were doing. Everyone was putting a shift in. I think Karim Adeyemi was perhaps the best example of that from a defensive point of view, where, this is the guy who was signed from Austria for scoring a bucket load of goals. But anyone who watched him last night may have thought he was a defensive midfielder, the way that he was tracking back, the way he was constantly tackling Hakimi anytime he had the audacity to step over the halfway line. And of course, there were so many kind of runners and defensive players in that team. And that's kind of how Dortmund have really managed to kind of pick up a lot of scalps in the Champions League this season. Another part of that, but obviously that only really works if you do have good attacking players who are able to kind of hold the ball and prove to be a great outlet. And that's really what Jadon Sancho did last night. I'm sure we're going to talk about, what he's done for Dortmund since his return, but I think he's proved to be a really important cog in that defensive system. And as a result, where Dortmund has struggled in the Bundesliga, they've proved to be this really good defensive team in the Champions League, capable of, not only kind of, giving PSG a bloody nose in this first leg, but obviously beating a very good Atletico Madrid side in the previous round. And not to mention, performances in the group stages as well. So, yeah, Jekyll and Hyde side that don't really work in the Bundesliga, but work really well in the Champions League.
Yeah, so you mentioned Jadon Sancho there. Nicholas Füllkrug might have got the goal, very well taken, but Jadon Sancho was the star of the show. He was man of the match. He recorded 12 dribbles in the game, which is the most any player has recorded in the Champions League this season. Nuno Mendes, who is worth noting, has recorded the fastest speed out of any player in the Champions League this season. He looked like a prime Titus Bramble. He was getting pulled all over the place by Jadon Sancho. It was an incredible performance. You follow Man Utd quite closely. How surprised have you been by the effect he's had at Dortmund, and why didn't we ever see that in a Man United shirt?
That's a $1 million question, or what, the £80 million question. The Manchester United signed Sancho. That's the player that they expected to get. I think there's a couple of factors behind it. Firstly, I don't think the way Manchester United play suits Sancho's style. I think he's best when he's kind of in transition and interchanging with players, short, sharp passes, and then kind of bursting away. And second of all, Sancho, there's a lot of revisionism, I think, around Sancho's time at Manchester United based off his incredible performance last night. Jadon Sancho wasn't good at Manchester United. He didn't play well. There's obviously loads of factors behind that, some that are kind of in the public domain and some which obviously aren't in the public domain. But I don't think anybody can deny that Jadon Sancho is an unbelievable talent. His records at Dortmund before, his numbers were incredible. I think, in a time where a lot of people say football can be quite boring in the modern era with the kind of the passing, keep the ball, all about movement. Sancho's the complete opposite of that. He's a player who gets you off your seat. You pay money to go and watch him in the form last night. He's a brilliant player, but I just think in terms of Manchester United, it didn't work out. I mean, a lot of people really question, could he go back to Manchester United in the summer? I think that will depend on who the manager is. If Ten Hag's the manager of Manchester United next season, I don't really see a way back for Jadon Sancho unless it comes from, Sir Jim Ratcliffe or, the new technical director or Dan Ashworth comes in and says to Ten Hag, look, if you're going to stay, you need to sort this situation out because you've got an incredible talent on our books who, can't play over a disagreement. So, yeah, Sancho, it didn't work at Manchester United. One unbelievable performance in the Champions League doesn't change, what he done at United, but there's no denying he's an incredible player. And it'll be interesting to see what happens this summer because not many clubs in the world will be able to afford Sancho's wages. He's on United, so it's a fascinating kind of, no doubt it'll turn into a saga over the summer window, much like it kind of did in January.
Yeah, another couple of questions for you, Stefan, as a man who follows the Premier League and the Bundesliga closely. With Jadon Sancho, I wonder whether is it a little bit of a case of Man United midfielding him? He's a player who likes to come into central areas and pick up the ball around them edge of the box. He's very good at threading those passes through. With Bruno Fernandes, who we discussed in the video recently this week, dominating that area, he hasn't really had those spaces for Man United. So I wonder whether that's something that's affected him. And just another point that Euan raised there. Obviously, a lot of us don't watch Bundesliga week in, week out. We watch the big Champions League games, and Sancho was obviously brilliant last night. But in the Bundesliga, he has just 5 goal contributions so far, and I think 17 games since his return to Dortmund on loan. I mean, is that his best performance we've seen in the Champions League, or was that reflective of what he's been doing week in, week out in the Bundesliga?
Yeah, it's a really interesting conundrum for Jadon Sancho. I think the difference between Jadon Sancho, the Jadon Sancho, the Dortmund player, and Jadon Sancho, the Man United player, is that at Borussia Dortmund, he could be the big fish in a small pond. And I mean that with all due respect to Dortmund, but, obviously speaking in context of the wider European football, he can be the main man. And I think you raised a really interesting point where, and Euan does a good job of mentioning that as well, in terms of how he fitted into that Man United team, where there were bigger players, there were bigger stars, there were players who demanded the ball. Their key players, Bruno Fernandes is a perfect example of that. Not only is he Man United's best player, but he's also the captain. He demands the ball at all times. And I think probably the best way of kind of looking at why Sancho works at Dortmund and why he maybe doesn't work at Man United is if you actually look at how many touches of the ball each Dortmund player has had in this Champions League run, you'll find that Jadon Sancho was one of the top for just about every game. I think he actually had more touches than any other player against PSG last night. He tends to average twice as many touches than Adeyemi on the other wing. And, you could almost kind of say he's almost like a kind of target man in that right wing role where they always try to get the ball out to him. He holds it. The rest of the team kind of adjust. They play off of him. And, as Euan mentioned, he's best in those kind of transition periods where he has a striker to play a 1-2 with or a midfield runner to kind of run off him. Or, as we saw a lot last night, Ryerson, the right back, was able to kind of run out the outside of him. So he's not a traditional winger in that sense, and he's more of and maybe he is more of an inside forward, or almost like a playmaker at times. Whereas in Man United, he was really pushed out quite wide, and he was asked to facilitate other players, which is just not really his style of football. So I think there's a whole kind of obviously mental aspect to it as well, where a player needs to feel loved, they have to feel supported, and maybe he just kind of struggled with the bright lights at Old Trafford. Not to mention all the stuff that's on and off the field that has obviously kind of troubled a lot of players at Man United over the years, but I do kind of think fundamentally he's needed a lot of attention, and he needs to be the main man in that team. And Borussia Dortmund are obviously more than happy to do that. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Euan also raised another good point by saying we have to be careful as to look at that performance and suggest, wow, he's gone from chalk to cheese in terms of Man United to Dortmund. At Dortmund, he has had a lot of slow games. He's had a lot of quiet games. He's had a lot of games where he hasn't looked fit at all. And at times, you know, there's a lot of kind of concerns that he was getting played over a young player like Bino Gittins, for example, another Englishman who, had Sancho not been brought in January, would have probably played a lot of football in the second half of the season. So there were question marks when he returned and the performances he was putting in, but you know, to Terzic's credit and to Dortmund's credit, they kind of stuck by him, and that performance we saw against PSG is the culmination of a player who's returned full fitness, but also kind of returned to a happy position in himself and a degree of comfort, which I guess he never really had at Man United. And I know these are all kind of things that we're talking about that you can't really quantify with stats or goals or assists, but I think fundamentally Sancho has to be the main man who has the ball at all times for his team, and also has to feel comfortable with the team and the club he's playing for. And I guess he gets that at Dortmund, and he didn't get that at Manchester United.
Okay, so what's next for Jadon Sancho? Does he have a future at Manchester United? Does Erik ten Hag need to shoulder some of the blame for not getting the best out of him? And could he be a late shout to make the England squad for the Euros this summer? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.